Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the third album from Pendulum, Immersion. So, I'm sure people have seen my review of In Silico, where I thought that album was probably my least favorite of Pendulum's three albums. So, you all probably already know my opinion on this album. I think it's great. So, how badly would it piss everyone off if I started off this review by talking about the ways this album is shit? Yes, I have some serious problems with this album, and I'm going to vent about them right here at the beginning, because, people love hearing me trash their favorite albums. Aside from a general lack of variety in comparison with the first two albums, the one thing that is absolutely disappointing about Immersion is that it is played 100% safe. Watercolour and In Silico both showed the band branching out their sound and trying a lot of different things, but there's really nothing on Immersion that wasn't already explored on those first two. Maybe a bit more focus in certain areas and combining the sounds of both albums together, but let's be real, this album didn't take a single risk. Hell, just look at the very beginning. You got Genesis, which is an orchestra-heavy intro, totally not like a prelude from Watercolour or anything, and Salt in the Wounds is almost an exact clone of Slam. Same tempo, same key, same synth settings, just a slightly different melody. And most of the other stuff just wrote off the success of Propane Nightmares and kind of did the same exact stuff. Even brought in some more of the metal elements from In Silico. Basically every single song on this album is a pump-up anthem, and there's not a single break. In the words of Steven Wilson, it may be cynical, but it all seems wrong. I gotta say, if you're gonna make an album as safe, non-risky, samey, and one-note as this, and just do nothing but pump-up anthems, you need to bring in some of the best pump-up material you've ever written. Stuff that completely blows any of the pump-up material from the previous two albums out of the water, have perfect top-notch production, and nail every single song. And, well, that's pretty much exactly what Pendulum did. To be fair, it's not like every song on Immersion is exactly the same, but there's nothing on your Midnight Runner or Plastic World that tones things down or is interesting to sit up and listen to. Everything is of the Fasten Your Seatbelts, Granite, or Showdown variety. If one were to tell me that they thought this album was kinda dull, and for the record I do know people who think this do exist, I would completely understand where they were coming from. The thing is though, this is really the kind of album that you don't use your brain for. Listening in depth doesn't ruin anything, but doesn't really reveal anything special either. It's purely the kind of album that is meant to pump you up. I may complain that Genesis and Salt in the Wounds are a lazy rehash of Prelude and Slam, but I can still enjoy all of them on their own merits. I can still tell the difference between them. Genesis is the one that has the 8-bit synths in it on top of the orchestras, while Prelude has the Twilight Zone sample. Both tracks have the exact same effect on me. And while Slam goes Salt in the Wounds goes Also, Salt in the Wounds has that section in the middle where the tempo randomly slows down, so yeah, I'm able to enjoy Salt in the Wounds perfectly fine by itself, even though there's that little voice in the back of my head saying, "This is a lazy reaction, you should be ashamed of yourself for enjoying this." And most of the other songs have a bit more mainstream pop focus to them, at least by Pendulum standards. I've seen a lot of different people tell me their favorite Rob Swire song, big single from this album, and there's quite the variety of opinions. Some people pick the catchy and rock-influenced Witchcraft, which is definitely one of the most fun tracks on here. Some people pick the much more metal-heavy Crush, which I wasn't huge on at first, given how it reminds me of some of my least favorite parts of In Silico, but much like those tracks, it's definitely a grower. But for me personally, my pick for best big single from this album is probably Watercolour. Not only do I really like the dramatic tones of certain sections of the track, and the horn sections that call back to Propane Nightmares a little bit, but it's also probably the catchiest of all the big singles, even though that may just be due to all my repeat listens of it. Face the fire, break your vision, throw your fists up, come on.
with me.
Well, of course, that doesn't include the even bigger elephant in the room, that is the two-parter track, The Island, which is the most popular single and probably the actual catchiest track on the album. The one that I was most immediately into when I first heard the album. The fact that it's a two-parter only adds to it. You got part 1, Dawn, which is poppier and more radio-friendly, contrasting with part 2, Dusk, which is clearly more of an EDM track. More intense and abrasive, complete with weird drops. Speaking of weird drops, there's almost a straight dubstep track on this album, Set Me On Fire, heavily hinting at the direction that Swire and McGrillen ended up going on their Knife Party project. We will be getting to that. This track is definitely one of the ones I was able to remember the most quickly, but it's not one of my personal favorites on here. Now, there are some tracks that focus more heavily on the metal elements. I already mentioned Crush, but there's also The Vulture, another track which initially didn't stand out to me, but has been growing on me. And there's Self vs. Self, which features the metal band In Flames as guest stars. I think I made it pretty clear that metal is not my genre. I'm not a huge fan of the screaming voice that the lead singer uses on this track, though, by the same token, Swire's weird inflections on comb brush ecos are somewhere in between whispering and metal growling. That track doesn't bother me nearly as much, so I really don't know what to tell you. They're all fine tracks, though, and I don't feel the urge to skip them. There are other guests on here in addition to In Flames, though, like Immunize, which brings on none other than Liam Howlett himself, which is a pretty obvious match given the similarities between Pendulum and The Prodigy. Swire finally got his daddy to notice him, and a damn great song came out of it too. Definitely one of the highlights from this album for me. But then there's also The Fountain featuring Steven Wilson. Oh my god, dude. Full disclosure, I'm actually a huge Steven Wilson and Porcupine Tree fan. I got a Storm Corrosion CD here, and I also have a CD of This Sky Moves Sideways that's going to be arriving in the mail in the next couple of weeks, I think. Now, this wasn't the case yet when I first heard the album, so The Fountain wasn't a standout initially, but when my little brother got me the actual CD here for Christmas, I saw Steven Wilson right there on the back cover, and I thought, oh my god, Steven Wilson's on this album? I never even noticed that. I immediately rushed in to hear the track, and it's since become a huge favorite from this album, maybe even eclipsing the Watercolour and The Island, because Jesus freaking Steven Wilson! And it's super catchy too, and brings in that Perry guy on guitar again. Seriously an underrated track here. That Perry guy's 3 for 3. And on the topic of underrated tracks, that leaves Under the Waves and Encoder, which also really only have started to become big favorites of mine recently. Under the Waves basically only clicked with me last night, actually, but damn is that track awesome now, with its more melodic focus and more chilled out intro. And Encoder was apparently co-written by that Perry guy again, so I guess that means he's actually 4 for 4. It's a wonderfully emotional and interesting track that finishes out the album on a fantastic note. So, overall, I mean, there's really not much else for me to say. There is that part of me that wants to trash this album for being the easiest route for Pendulum to follow up their previous 2 albums and make more money. There's a part of me that wants to nitpick and say, well, I don't like the voice of that one guy from In Flames, and I wish they had more variety like they did on their other 2 albums. But that part of me can go fuck itself. This isn't an album you're supposed to think about. It's supposed to pump you up and deliver some of the band's best melodies to date. And they pull that off for sure. What this album lacks in interesting experimentation, it makes up for in just pure personal enjoyment. I will understand the minority who doesn't like it, but for me personally, every track is a winner, and I say it's an absolute must-listen. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.